Hi, this is Dr. Sebastian Rushworth. Welcome to my podcast. My guest today is Dr. Christine Stabell Benn. Christine is a Danish physician and a professor at the University of Southern Denmark. And for almost 30 years, Christine has been a vaccine researcher. And she's been doing research mostly in West Africa, in a country with a high death rate from infectious diseases, and but also doing some research here in the Western world. And the focus of her research has been on nonspecific vaccine effects, i.e. all those other effects on our immune system and our health that vaccines have beyond their immediate effect in terms of protecting against one specific infectious disease. And her findings have actually been pretty amazing and have upended what has previously always been believed about vaccines, that they impact our protection from one disease, and that's pretty much it. And what she's found is that certain classes of vaccines have an effect on overall mortality that can't be explained by their impact on this one disease they're supposed to protect against. So they're clearly doing something more, providing some additional benefit. And she's also found that other classes of vaccines have the opposite effect, so that even though they're protecting against one infectious disease, overall they're actually increasing mortality. So there is some kind of harm that they're causing. So this is a kind of an in-depth conversation where we go into detail about vaccines and their both beneficial and harmful non-specific effects. We also touch on the COVID vaccines and get Christine's opinion on them. This is a conversation that I learned a lot from, and I hope you will too. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Christine Stabell Benn. Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So the focus of your research is non-specific vaccine effects. Could you explain a bit about what a non-specific vaccine effect is and how this came to be the focus of your research?
Yeah, so non-specific effects of vaccines are the effect of vaccines on the immune system, the more general effects on the immune system that may affect how the immune system responds to subsequent challenges, also those unrelated to the vaccine disease. I came into this research agenda in 93, so almost 30 years ago. But at that time, it was already established by my mentor, Peter Abbey, who's actually an anthropologist, but started working in Guinea-Bissau in 1978 and very quickly realized that, in a process of doing a lot of other things, that measles at that time was a big killer of children, and as a service to the community, they gave measles vaccine to all children who were at home when they were doing their rounds in Guinea-Bissau. At that time, there was no measles vaccine available, so this was really an additional vaccine that the children wouldn't have had otherwise. And what turned out to be a major observation was the fact that when they came back a year later, there was a huge difference in mortality among those who had received and not received the measles vaccine. And everybody knew what measles was and could diagnose measles. And it was very clear that the children who had not died from measles, they had died from other causes. And the huge difference in mortality, and almost 70% difference in mortality, or 70% reduced mortality in those who had received the measles vaccine, could not be ascribed to just prevention of measles infection. So this was a major observation that really contradicted everything everybody thought they knew about measles vaccine, because it was only supposed to save the children who would otherwise have died from measles, but it turned out that it seemed to save children from a lot of other infections that were prevalent at that time. That was so incredible. So of course that was not an observation that in itself could lead to a change in the understanding of vaccines. But what Peter did after realizing this dramatic effect of measles vaccine was to go and approach other sites around the world who had that had introduced measles vaccine and studied or had data on the overall mortality effect. And it turned out that in all the available data sets, the introduction of measles vaccine was associated with at least a 50% reduction in all-cause mortality, so dramatically more than could in any way be anticipated from just protecting against measles. So this was really Peter's observation, surprising observation, which I think somehow might have been dismissed if it was a medical doctor making that observation, because the medical doctor would have been primed to think that this was implausible. How could a vaccine against measles protect against other diseases? But I guess for an anthropologist with an unbiased mind, it was just the data that spoke, and the data spoke a very clear language. So this was how nonspecific effects were discovered. And I joined in 93, and I've formed a team with Peter ever since, where we have kind of one by one gone through, or at the same time now managed to cover a total of 10 vaccines with this type of evaluation, and discovering that for all these vaccines that we have studied, it turns out that their overall mortality effect cannot at all be explained by their effect against the vaccine disease.
And I guess all this data is observational, but you feel like it can't be, or you have trial data supporting this too.
So I mean, clearly this is observational data. We know there is an inherent bias in studies of vaccines, and that is that generally it will be the healthy children who are vaccinated first. So there is a bias in favor of any vaccine that you study when it's just about comparing those children whose parents brought them for vaccination with those children who weren't brought for vaccination, because everywhere in the world, in Guinea-Bissau, in Denmark, in Sweden, parents are reluctant to bring their ill children for vaccination. So clearly any observational studies showing some effect on or some mortality difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated children could be suspected to suffer from these, what we call healthy vaccinee bias. So it has been extremely important that we have been able to take many of these observations forward to randomized trials. And generally speaking, just as a rule of thumb, if we see a 50% mortality reduction in an observational study, that translates into a 30% mortality reduction in a randomized trial. So that gives you an idea about the size of confounding or selection bias that's introduced in the observational studies. But what remains is that even in randomized trials, we see these strong effects on mortality, which cannot be ascribed to the prevention of the vaccine disease. And the interesting thing is that for some vaccines, we would say interesting, also worrying thing, but for some vaccines, we actually see that in the observational studies, when we compare those vaccinated with those unvaccinated, there's a higher mortality in those who have been vaccinated. So I started out talking about these strongly beneficial effects of measles vaccine, but the problematic observation, and I guess the real controversy here, is that we actually also see that for some vaccines it's opposite. The vaccines protect against the vaccine disease, but in spite of that, their introduction is not associated with lower overall mortality. And if we compare kids who have received the vaccine versus those who haven't received them, in spite of all these biases, those who have received the vaccine are still dying more than those who haven't received the vaccine. So the benefits of being protected against the vaccine disease seem to be offset by and outbalanced by a negative effect of the vaccine on the risk of other infections.
Okay, so you see both this positive non-specific effect with some vaccines, that they have this extra benefit in terms of reduced overall mortality that can't be explained just by their disease specific effect. And then you have other vaccines where it's the opposite, where you actually see increased mortality, even though you would expect decreased mortality because they have this disease specific benefit.
Because they have the disease-specific benefit, and because they are also, the studies, the observational studies, would be prone to this healthy vaccinee bias. So you can see it's even though all the biases that are available will work, both the effect of the vaccine and the biases would work in favor of the vaccine. We see this opposite pattern.
And what do you think explains these non-specific effects, and why is there this difference that some vaccines show a beneficial effect and some show a harmful effect?
The pattern we have observed is that the live vaccines, live attenuated vaccines, which mimics a natural infection, it's just so mild that you really don't get any symptoms from it. You can get a slight fever, a slight rash after a measles vaccine, but generally speaking, it's so mild that you don't really feel it. These live attenuated vaccines, they seem to have the beneficial nonspecific effects, or they are all associated with beneficial nonspecific effects. So larger reductions in all-cause mortality. But in contrast, the non-live vaccines, where you have the disease organism, you vaccinate with the dead disease organism or products or parts of the disease organism, there you see the negative nonspecific effects. And those two types of vaccines are actually quite profoundly different in the way that the immune system handles them, because the live vaccines normally create a good natural immunity, or a good broad immunity already after one dose. So you rarely need more than one dose to get a good long protection of against the vaccine disease. So we know that for measles vaccine, we use it as MMR vaccine in our parts of the world with measles, mumps, and rubella. We give 2 doses, but it's really just to, safeguard, because more than 90% will be protected for life by just 1 dose. So these live vaccines give good long immunity. The non-live vaccines, in contrast, all parents will know, because that's the vaccines they have to go to get booster shots with. You have a series of vaccines like the pentavalent or hexavalent vaccines against diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, etc. These vaccines, you have to come in Denmark at 3, 5, 12 months to complete a series of vaccines. And you need to give them so many times because they are actually pretty inert. The immune system isn't very interested. Sensibly enough, it thinks, well, here's something dead. It can't really threaten me, so why should I respond to it? So the non-live vaccines often have to be given with an adjuvant, a helper substance to make the immune system respond, and it has to be given in several doses to really create immunity. So in the end, both types of vaccines will create good immunity against the vaccine diseases, but they do it in a quite fundamental way. And it seems that these differences in administration are, or in live versus non-live, also are very meaningful in terms of how they then train the immune system against all other pathogens as well. And we are still trying to understand how this takes place, because this is clearly contradicting everything in the medical textbooks, which say that a vaccine should not be able to induce memory towards other disease organisms. You have learned about vaccines, how they will go in and be picked up by an antigen presenting cell that will activate B cells and T helper cells and T killer cells, and you will have your particularly our focus has been on the B cells, which will then turn into plasma cell, produce antibody which specifically recognize the disease organism and create B memory cells which will stay there with this memory of this particular disease organism. And it has been so evident, self-evident, I think, to people, to medical doctors, that this was what happened and nothing more would happen, that nobody actually ever cared to look if the vaccines could affect other arms of the immune system, other basically affect the response to other disease organisms. But we are getting much wiser, and I'll pause here, but I can come back to some of the mechanisms that we are now discovering for how this training of the immune system or tolerizing of the immune system with vaccines can actually take place.
I know this is kind of the standard in medicine, in medical research. Isn't it strange that we do studies in such a way that we're only looking at the specific disease-specific benefit? Shouldn't studies always be looking at the overall effect? Because, I mean, who cares if a drug decreases your risk of one thing if it's at the same time increasing your risk of something else? Shouldn't that be the standard in medical research? Why do you think it isn't?
I've read with great pleasure the book what is called Ending Medical Reversals by Vinay Prasad and Adam Sifu. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they deal with exactly that question and propose that we are somehow biased by our own perception of how good we are as medical doctors to understand the physiology, the pathophysiology, etc. So we do think that if we give a cancer treatment that makes the tumor shrink, then obviously it must be beneficial for overall mortality, so we don't really bother to study it. We do think that if we have a screening program against a prostate cancer that detects the cancer earlier, then of course it must also translate into lower mortality. But again, we are so certain that we don't bother to study it. And in these situations, I think it's more and more generally accepted now that these surrogate outcomes are not associated with the overall health outcome. And we may get really we may make some very big mistakes if we use the surrogates as outcomes for our clinical trials and for our as a treatment outcome, because we have seen numerous examples, and that's what they expose in their book, of how completely biologically plausible surrogate outcomes turn out, in fact, in real trials and assessments not to be associated with lower mortality. On the contrary. And as you allude to, of course, for a patient, you don't care if your tumor shrinks or if it's detected earlier, if it doesn't affect your final outcome, whether you live or die, and potentially the treatment you take will make you feel lousy, and the screening program will turn you into a patient much earlier than you had otherwise been, and make your life miserable. So there are so many aspects of that I could talk about for hours, about the ways we go wrong if we only look at what we believe is the only outcome of our intervention. I think it's more generally accepted, as I said, for cancer treatment, etc., for cancer screening and so on. But what's still surprisingly difficult to transmit is the fact that just looking at a vaccine's effect against the vaccine disease is not associated with the predicted effect on overall mortality either. And we might make the same type of mistakes if we only look at a vaccine's effect on the vaccine disease.
So you mentioned that you see this kind of clear difference between live vaccines and non-live vaccines. And is that like a general class difference that regardless which live vaccine you look at, you see this beneficial effect on overall mortality, and regardless which non-live vaccine you look at, you see a neutral or negative effect on overall mortality? Is that the case across the board?
I'm reluctant to say that it's a general pattern, because there might still be things that contradict this pattern, but it is the pattern we have observed, and I'm myself quite astonished by it, because we are talking about quite heterogeneous classes of vaccines. So within the group of live vaccines, they're not at all very similar. The thing they have in common is the being live. They replicate, they divide themselves in the body, and we have other peoples have shown that there are these vitapams, there are receptors in the body that sense this kind of important signal for the body body that here you have a disease organism that can actually replicate. So we know it turns on a different kind of signaling than the non-live vaccines, as I also touched upon. But in themselves, they're quite, between them, they're quite different. The measles vaccine is injected subcutaneously. The oral polio vaccine is given as drops on a sugar lump. Many people in our part of the world will remember going to the doctor and getting these small sugar lumps with drops on them that you ate. So they come in via the mucosa. So they're quite different. And particularly with regards to the non-live vaccines, they are also very heterogeneous. So when we have been looking for commonalities, at some stage in the beginning, the non-live vaccines we studied were aluminium adjuvated, so we thought, oh, maybe it's the alum that's the culprit. It has a tendency to trigger the immune system into what we call a Th2 direction, and it's used historically because it just gave good antibodies. It's really turning on the arm of the immune system where you can get antibodies. So we thought maybe the alum will twist the immune system away from the Th1 response that it needs sometimes and really misdirect it in a Th2 direction. But then we studied other non-live vaccines which weren't alum adjuvated, and we saw the same negative effect. So alum is not the commonality. The common thing for the non-live vaccines is that you give them into the muscle, which is, technically speaking, also a quite stupid place to if you think about the immune system, because the immune system is not present in the muscle. It's not where you're supposed to meet your pathogens. They come in via your mucosa. So you don't have a standing arm of immune cells in your muscles, but that's where you inject the non-live vaccines, and that's where all the immune cells are heading. And that, we have speculated, could somehow lead to a different compartmentalization of your immune cells. It might actually be part of the explanation why it could misdirect the immune system.
How long do the non-specific effects last? Is it months or weeks or years, or how long, say, after the BCG vaccine do you see this benefit on overall mortality?
So you're picking the best of them all, I think, maybe BCG and smallpox vaccines, because they are the vaccines where we've seen effects persist for decades. So we did a study in Denmark where we looked at the cohort born between 65 and 76. So this was the cohort that experienced the phase out of both these vaccines. So they went from almost 100% coverage to almost 0% coverage over this 10-year period. So this was what you call a natural experiment. This is a situation where there wasn't much healthy vaccinee bias. It was really the year that you were born that determined whether you were vaccinated or not. And we followed all these cohort members up to the age of 45, and we could show that there was more than 40% reduced all-cause mortality from natural causes if you had been BCG or smallpox vaccinated versus you hadn't received any of these vaccines. So reassuringly, there was no effect on murders and suicides and accidents. But if we looked at all the natural causes, we saw very broadly that mortality was significantly reduced in those who received those two vaccines. For other vaccines, we have been partly limited by the fact that one thing that's important to mention is that these non-specific effects are strongest as long as a vaccine is the most recently given. So we have seen that if you give, for instance, a diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. Well, let me start with BCG vaccine. It's the vaccine that you give at birth. If you in low-income countries, after BCG vaccine, if we compare in the time window where BCG is the most recent vaccine, we can see that those who received BCG vaccine have lower mortality than those who didn't get BCG vaccine. Then comes in Guinea-Bissau the age of 6 weeks, and all the children are offered a DTP vaccine against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. Then, in this time window, comparing those who received DTP versus those who didn't receive DTP, those who were vaccinated have the higher mortality compared with those who weren't vaccinated. And Then comes the measles vaccine at 9 months, and then it's vice versa again. Those who were vaccinated with measles vaccine have lower mortality than those who weren't vaccinated with measles vaccine. And it's the same kids we kind of follow over time. So it's of course groups of children, but these patterns we see indicate that these non-specific effects can be abrogated, and this is really the good news in terms of the negative non-specific effects of non-live vaccines, that they seem to be gone when you give a live vaccine. You can train your immune system back to the state where it's prepared to meet other enemies again if you give a live vaccine. So given the nature of the vaccine program, where vaccines are given sequentially, we haven't had much opportunity to follow the long-term effects of some of these vaccines. But at least I would say they last 6 months or until a new vaccine is given. And for some vaccines, we have evidence that they may last for decades, and also may last in spite of other vaccines being given afterwards. So with the BCG and smallpox vaccine, it seems that there is some long-lived imprinting effect which can override whatever happens afterwards. And for BCG, we then have also now a very intriguing mechanism, because we can show that it has been a puzzle. How could a BCG vaccine have such not only effects on other pathogens? Now we know with the trained immunity, the emergency the granular poiesis with the neutrophils, etc. But also how could that be sustained over a long period? But we have shown now that BCG enters the bone marrow and trains the stem cells in the bone marrow. So the mothers and fathers of all your innate immune cells that hide in the bone marrow and produce new cells when needed, they change their phenotype. They simply change their profile after meeting BCG, and they're the ones that stay in the bone marrow. So the immune cells go out and die after a short time, but there will be continuously produced more that will have this new memory from having met BCG.
There's been this gradual transition, I guess, where more and more vaccines are non-live, and at least in the Western world, I think the vast majority of vaccines people are given are non-live vaccines. Do you think overall that is a harmful trend that should be avoided, or how should we be handling that in light of your research findings?
So it's important to say that the majority of our findings are done in Guinea-Bissau and in low and middle income countries, and our outcome of interest has been overall mortality, and mortality has been so high, so we have actually been able to show significant differences in mortality. In our part of the world, fortunately, it's not an outcome that you can use for childhood vaccines because mortality is so low, but we have looked at another marker of overall child health, namely the risk of getting infected or getting hospitalized with infectious diseases. And we do see some similar patterns in our part of the world. So what we have shown in Denmark is that if you give measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, then the risk of getting hospitalized with infectious diseases decreases compared with the children who remain with their DTP vaccine. We have these issues with healthy vaccine bias in our part of the world also, but at least in Denmark, there is some delay in, when your child is 15 months old and you have to call the medical doctor to make an appointment for the MFR vaccine or the MMR vaccine, then you can get an appointment 3 weeks later and so on. So there is some, we have adjusted for all kind of confounders. We do think we see a reliable pattern of lower infectious disease hospitalizations after MFR compared with having the pentavalent vaccine as your most recent vaccine. Colleagues from CDC in the US have found a similar pattern with lower risk of non-targeted infectious hospitalizations after live versus non-live vaccines. So of course, the effects are less pronounced in a setting like in a high-income setting where infectious diseases are not that prevalent, where they're not that deadly, fortunately. But I still think it could make a difference, yes, also in our part of the world, to have more live vaccines. And definitely it does seem to make a world of a difference in low and middle income countries. There's an Australian pediatrician who made calculations based on the WHO's review of non-specific effects, which took place in 2014, and produced a series of estimates of effects of these different vaccines. And just using these effect estimates from the review and looking at the recommended childhood vaccination program in low-income countries, he calculated that if the vaccination program was altered to optimize not only the specific but also the non-specific effects of vaccines, using the same vaccines just in a different order and sequence, could reduce global child mortality by 1 million deaths every year. So there is a huge potential in using live vaccines and generally speaking, using the vaccines intelligently so they optimize also the non-specific effects.
Why don't we just replace all non-live vaccines with the live vaccines?
I think the major stumbling point is, and that's important to mention, that live vaccines carry the tiny risk that if you give them to people who have weakened immune systems, they can actually become vicious. So if you have AIDS, you're not only HIV positive, but you have AIDS, you're immunocompromised, then you can get BCG-itis. You can actually get an infection from the BCG vaccine against tuberculosis, which can, in worst cases, kill you. So clearly, the live vaccines are kind of, wild beasts that we have leashed, and normally they would never hurt you, but in a very immunocompromised person, and we're not just talking about somebody who says, I get ill all the time. We're talking about people who are severely immunocompromised. In such people, the vaccines can cause the real disease or something similar. So that is a caveat with the live vaccines. Plus, they are quite difficult to produce and also to handle in the vaccine chain out from the producer to the children, because they typically have to be kept cold. They are often freeze-dried. Once you dilute them, you have to use the vaccine within 4 to 6 hours. So there are also some logistical issues. But in many settings, and in many people and many settings, these small problems, so to speak, with the live vaccines would be easily overcome. And again, there's really seems to be some potential, both in terms of the specific protection that we touched upon, that's easily achievable and often with fewer doses and often more long-lasting with the live vaccines, but particularly in terms of the non-specific effects.
And I mean, those negative aspects seem very small in relation to the fact that it's only with the live vaccines that you're actually seeing any benefit on overall mortality. And I mean, it's hard to see, at least from my perspective, it's hard to see how you can make a positive cost-benefit analysis if you're not actually seeing any overall benefit of giving a certain treatment.
One good example, which is something that's keeping us awake at night right now, is the oral polio vaccine and the inactivated polio vaccine. So this is a polio disease, which is almost eradicated, but where we have a live and a non-live vaccine, and the high-income countries have more and more switched to the non-live polio vaccine because the live vaccine can also, in rare cases, give polio-like disease in those who receive it. But the low-income countries, it's much cheaper to give the oral polio vaccine, the live polio vaccine, and it's easy to administer in the mouth. So and it gives good immunity also against transmission. It's actually the only way we can ever eradicate polio, because the inactivated polio vaccine, like most non-live vaccines, it gives you antibody in your body, so you don't get ill if you get polio. But in fact, it doesn't prevent you from getting polio on your mucosa and getting infected. It just prevents you from getting diseased. But the oral polio vaccine also prevents you from getting infected and from transmitting to others. So the oral polio vaccine has been used and is being used in low-income countries to eradicate polio. But it has this small problem with I think last year it was 17 children globally who got this polio-like disease. So it's a tiny number of children. But that is why the WHO is now trying to stop all polio vaccine. And the plan was to stop it by 2020. Now the plan is by 2024. I don't think they will manage it because there's still polio here and there, and they can only eradicate it with the oral polio vaccine. But I'm getting gray hairs by the thought that we are about to stop a vaccine, which now in our studies, we just recently started studying it, actually. It was kind of number 10 in the line of vaccines we studied, but it's associated with tremendous reductions in child mortality. So every time there's been a polio campaign, we can show there is a 15% reduction in all-cause mortality. And we can actually historically show that during the last 20 years, when all polio vaccine has been used in campaigns, mortality, it can explain most of the child mortality decline that has been seen in low-income countries. So the real fear is that this vaccine, the live vaccine against polio, is stopped, and we will see child mortality start increasing again. Because there's nobody who is studying the overall health effect of inactivated and all polio vaccine.
So I'm a parent. I have small children at home, and I guess probably some of the people listening are parents too. So in light of these non-specific effects, if as a parent you want to optimize your child's overall health rather than their specific protection for various infections, how should you be thinking? Should you just follow the official vaccine recommendations, or should you be interfering in some way, saying yes to certain vaccines, no to other vaccines? How should I be thinking as a parent in terms of which vaccines I let my children take?
Yeah, I usually say when I'm presenting, I have a disclaimer right in the beginning, because I'm saying things that could easily make people tag me as an anti-vaxxer. I think that I'm not it should be hopefully obviously for anybody seeing this that I'm not an anti-vaxxer. But there are people are adjusted to the public messaging about vaccines. They're hashtag vaccines work, they're safe, efficient, don't worry, etc. So anybody raising issues like the ones I'm raising here have to walk on a very narrow line and make sure that the messaging is as balanced as possible. And I always start by saying that I have 2 children myself, a girl and a boy. One thing we haven't talked about is that these non-specific effects are sex differential. So the negative effects are primarily seen for the girls, and only in some instances seen for the girls, which is yet another intriguing thing that we are trying to understand better. But in both cases, with my son and my daughter, they followed the common childhood vaccination program in Denmark, and it's actually a pretty good vaccination program, because even from a non-specific point of view, it makes sure that children in Denmark have live vaccines as their most recent vaccine for the majority of childhood. I would go on a very dangerous path, if I started giving specific recommendations and alterations to the program, but I do see potential for improving it. For instance, in Denmark, we give MMR booster at 4 years, and we give a DTP booster at 5 years, a nonlive booster at 5 years of the pentavalent vaccine. And there's really no good reason why it should be in that sequence. So I would much prefer, from a non-specific point of view, data would indicate it would be better to give the MMR vaccine at 5 years and the DT booster at 4 years. But if I were the Minister of Health or the head of the Danish Medical Board or whatever, I would love to do a large-scale randomized trials that the Finnish are famous for doing, making, one region do one program, another region do another program. In Sweden, you have your different amter, I think, yeah. But you could do cluster randomized trials where you could let different schedules, which should have no overall impact on specific immunity, but could have potential impact on non-specific immunity, where you could compare them against each other in a non-biased fashion and really look for ways to optimize our vaccination program while making sure that children get their vaccines.
So we already talked about how we already have or we have the COVID pandemic ongoing, and we've had these massive vaccination campaigns, and all the vaccines currently available are non-live vaccines, which I guess you would then assume don't result in any reduction in overall mortality. It might even increase it. So this might be the part of the conversation that we need to cut out if we want this video not to be removed from YouTube. But I was just wondering how you feel personally about the COVID vaccines in light of this.
Yeah, so I think I have said that openly, so I'm happy to say that on this podcast also. It's clear from the discovery of non-specific effects that the current system for testing vaccines is not sufficient, because it only looks at the effect of the vaccine against the vaccine disease, and then it looks for plausible side effects, and they are typically registered within the trials leading to approval of the vaccine. They are registered within the first weeks after vaccination in the typical forms that we know it: fever, headache, fatigue, etc. Then the trials also capture serious adverse events leading to hospitalizations and death, and that may go on for longer, or that does go on for the full duration of the trial. But most of these serious adverse events that occur are dismissed as not being related to the vaccine, because nobody, as a starting point, anticipate that the vaccine would give anything but these typical side effects in the first weeks. So one example is appendicitis, which came out as a signal in, I think, the Pfizer trial that led to approval of the vaccine, but where those assessing the serious adverse events and saw there were more appendicitis in the Pfizer vaccine said, this is probably not related to the vaccine, because why should the vaccine give appendicitis? But that signal was later confirmed when the vaccine was rolled out in Israel. There was a 40% significantly increased risk of appendicitis in those who got the Pfizer vaccine versus those that hadn't gotten it yet. So coming back to this thing we started with the biological plausibility, as long as nobody has studied a new vaccine, everything is basically plausible in my point of view. But it looks as if for the people conducting the trials, if you look at the list of severe adverse events and the way they're judged in the trials, their default is more the other way around, that unless something is very biologically plausible somehow, and I guess basically the presumption is that nothing is biologically plausible. You know, it has to, the burden of evidence is towards proving over any doubt that the new disease occurring after vaccination, the serious adverse events, was due to the vaccine rather than the other way around. And the real problem from my point of view is that any infection occurring after vaccination in a randomized trial, a clinical trial for approval, would be dismissed the way the system is right now. With the current paradigm for vaccines, nobody would see a pneumonia with a bacteria occurring 3 months after your mRNA vaccine as a potential result of the vaccine. It would be, dismissed before you could even write it on paper as being due to the vaccine. But for all we know, it could very well be the result of the vaccine twisting your immune system so that you became more susceptible to other disease organisms. I should say, that's a flaw in the current system for testing vaccines, that they don't look for non-specific effects. They don't look for other infections. And if they see them disproportionately, then they would be dismissed as a chance finding, because it would be said it was biologically implausible. For the mRNA vaccines and the adenovirus vector vaccines, I've actually been in doubt whether they were live and non-live. I'm not happy with the way they were tested, because they didn't test for overall mortality and morbidity, and they didn't look for very long. whereas we know the non-specific effects could last at least 6 months and potentially longer. So the system was not good enough. I've been in doubt whether the COVID vaccines would be live or non-live, because they're really a new type of vaccine. And it could be that the way the mRNA is processed in the cell, particularly with the adenovirus vector vaccines, that it could resemble something that was a live pathogen. But the only study we have so far is from our Dutch colleagues who looked at the Pfizer vaccine and saw that it had a pattern that looks like what we've seen for non-live vaccines. So it induced 2 weeks after the second dose, those who had received them had a more lazy innate immune system. They had increased tolerance. So if you stimulated their cells with other viruses and bacteria, they didn't respond as much as before the vaccine. So this is a tiny piece of evidence, and I want to emphasize, I don't want to say that it's in any way should scare people away and think this vaccine has negative non-specific effects, but the tiny piece of evidence we have point in that direction. Plus, I should say, I'm not completely happy with the overall mortality in the randomized trials. They looked for overall mortality. Clearly, the trials were not sized. They didn't look for it. The trials were not sized to look at overall mortality, but if you just look at the crude mortality, there were no reduction in overall mortality. There were not less death. There were actually a bit more death in the vaccinated in the control trials than in the unvaccinated, in spite of the fact that there were fewer COVID deaths. So very tiny pieces of evidence, which to me suggests that it might not be. It would still, in my point of view, be extremely important to study these effects for these vaccines for their effect on overall mortality. The jury is still out.
The thing I find most shocking about the COVID vaccine trials is that 2 months into the trial, they gave the vaccine to the control group. So we don't have any long-term follow-up. And like you say, non-specific effects can be expected for months or years out. And we really we'll never have that data now, because there is no placebo group from more than 2 months out in the trials.
Yeah. Well, 4 months, I think, at best, but it's too short time, and I completely agree with you. And I find it appalling that the control group was vaccinated. It was, after all, they had entered the trial on the condition that they were going to be in the control group for 2 years. I think we could have maintained that randomization for the sake of mankind. We need this kind of data, and particularly in now when we're rolling the vaccines out to so many millions of people. And this is why I've been strongly advocating that we should not vaccinate people who weren't at risk of COVID-19. So with a disease that is has such an age mortality profile, clearly if you're over 75 and have other morbidities, etc., it looks like a very good idea to get the vaccine, and you could live with a quite substantial amount of side effects. But if you're a child, maybe looking into getting this vaccine on a yearly basis, from which we have absolutely no data. We have seen, as I said, for the live vaccines, that beneficial non-specific effects are boosted with each dose of live vaccine, but we also have indications for the non-live vaccines that the negative non-specific effects get worse with each dose of vaccine. So from my perspective, it's one should be very cautious with giving this vaccine year after year after year to children who have, for all we know, nothing to gain from the specific, or very, very little to gain from the specific protection against COVID-19.
Why do you think critical vaccine research is so taboo? I mean, why do we have this situation in medicine where you can't even slightly question anything to do with vaccines, where we're supposed to pretend like they can only ever be beneficial and positive and can't ever result in harm? Why do we have, we don't have this, we don't think this way about any other class of drugs. We realize that they have benefits and they also have harms, and those always need to be weighed against each other. But when it comes to vaccines, there is no balanced thinking at all. We're just completely uncritical. Why is that, do you think?
There is something very unfortunate happening in the debate. I think there are two extreme groups, and they're actually quite small, but they have been allowed to dominate. And these are the extreme anti-vaxxers who are saying vaccines are bad for, vaccines are bad, punctuation mark. They are not interested. I mean, I talk with them. They might cherry pick our results on negative nonspecific effects, but they completely dismiss the results on positive nonspecific effects, beneficial nonspecific effects. They're not interested in the science. They're interested in cherry picking the parts that fit into the narrative that vaccines are bad and harmful and you should never take them. And then I don't know what came first, but there is an just as extreme group, in my point of view, which are pro-vax. And I'm saying that as with just the same sentiments as I say anti-vax, because these people are extremely science resistant as well. They will not look at our data and look at them from a scientific perspective. They will dismiss them. They will look for the error, the reason to say this is rubbish, this should not be taken serious. They will try to tag me as an anti-vaxxer for, proposing anything like that. So, smear me. They are, or anybody proposing this kind of nuances. So they're just as religious as the anti-vaxxers, just in the opposite direction. And somehow we have some kind of centrifugal forces here that has forced the debates out into these two poles, where there will be on one side those saying vaccines are bad and the other is saying vaccines are good, and they have stolen the whole center court of the field where we really should have the debate, and where I think most people are, where they like to look at the science, discuss pros and cons, and a large majority on the center court are super positive around vaccines, but also acknowledge that they can have side effects. And then there are some people there who are generally skeptical about vaccines, who can see that and don't dismiss that they protect against severe diseases, but are more concerned about the side effects. This is really between these groups of people that the discussion should take place, that we should look at the science, discuss pros and cons, design new studies which could, help to resolve any doubts, etc. Yeah, I guess it's also happening in politics. There are areas where things get so polarized that it's hard to get back to the sensible conversation.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Christine. This has been a fascinating conversation. Where can people find out more about your work?
We have a webpage, www.bendim.org, and I've done a TEDx where I give a slight, a summary of what we have talked about here. Generally, I'm available on the social media, on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and always happy to share and discuss.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
Guess what? What you just listened to was not the full interview. In order to get access to the full-length, uncut version of the interview, you'll need to sign up as a patron, which you can do at patreon.com/Sebastian Rushworth. Patrons get access to a private podcast feed with full-length versions of all the interviews I do. They also get access to my private forum and all the interesting conversations happening there. And they gain the ability to send me private direct messages. I always respond to messages from my patrons. So please support my work by becoming a patron and signing up at patreon.com/Sebastian Rushworth.